Good morning, folks, and welcome to today's webinar. It's 11 a.m., so let's start. My name is John Schatzman, and I'm the Marketing Manager for nScaled. I'd like to welcome you to nScaled's webinar called Budgeting for IT Disaster Recovery. Our presenters today are our CEO, Paul Ciandrini, and our Director of Professional Services, Dan Linder. We hope that you'll find this webinar professionally interesting and time well spent. But before we jump in, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be presented in listen-only mode, but we encourage you to interact with our speakers by using the questions section in the GoToMeeting panel on the lower right-hand portion of your screen. And as many of you know, IT disaster recovery is a very broad topic. So do take advantage of the opportunity today to ask questions about your particular infrastructure or areas of interest. So let's get to our speakers. Prior to becoming nScaled CEO, Paul Ciandrini was CEO of HydroPoint Data Systems. And before that, he was Chief Risk Officer for Bearing Point. He was also President and COO for Plumtree Software. And before Plumtree, he was the Senior Vice President of North American Application Sales at Oracle, reporting directly to Larry Ellison. And before Oracle, he managed Bearing Point's international high technology practice. And joining Paul today is Dan Linder. He's our Director of Professional Services Program Office. In this role, Dan manages the team that helps nScaled customers efficiently integrate our platform into their current infrastructure, offering advice and assistance on implementing best practices. Dan has over 15 years' experience in software development, professional services, and IT project and program management. His experience ranges from enterprise application integration, IT infrastructure management, and regulatory compliance in diverse sectors such as healthcare, biotech, and financial services. Before nScaled, Dan was a Senior Program Manager at Wells Fargo, responsible for financial fraud detection systems. And before that, he was Director of Software Development at Property Sciences. And before that, he was a Senior Project Program and Process Manager for Nokia's Global Mobile Application Development. So let's get right to it. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Ciandrini. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. Thank you for participating. Today we're going to be covering kind of a complex topic. We'll be focusing primarily on the business side of disaster recovery today, but as we go through the budgeting process and the risk assessment process, we'll start to see some of the technical components really come to light. Backup and disaster recovery business drivers. What are the issues we need to address? What are their impacts? Who is responsible within the organization, and what are the approaches available to address these requirements? That's what we're going to really talk about today. It's important, basically, to determine business risk tolerance. The disaster recovery management of risk really is predicated on understanding what are the risks to your particular business. Where do we engage with the most appropriate responses to our business needs? What are the solution approaches that are available to us, and do they effectively match or align with our business risk tolerance and budget constraints? And then how do we compare these alternatives effectively? You know, when we take a look at the business drivers for disaster recovery, we really need to determine what the real organizational needs are. And what you can see on the screen right now, these are fairly high level, and we're going to drill into a little bit more detail with specifics for you as we go through this. But you got to remember that the predicate here is that business is completely dependent on IT. If there is downtime, there's negative business impact. We need to easily and quickly recover files, servers, and sometimes data centers. We need to provide this function while working with progressively greater cost constraints in our IT environments. We need to make sure that data is always held confidentially and never at risk. And then we really have a lot more complex regulatory compliance requirements that we now need to address. HIPAA, FDIC, FERC, FSMA, FDA, OSHA, the line goes on and on and on. And what's interesting about that is a lot of our businesses do business with companies in other verticals. And so as soon as we basically start to utilize their information, we are now required to meet the compliance requirements of their particular verticals. For example, if you're a law firm and you're dealing with any type of medical record, you basically need to be HIPAA compliant. Again, the risks and the impacts of not being compliant are material to organizations. With all that, we have to deal with explosive data growth, backup windows that decrease as reliance on IT systems increase, regulatory compliance deadlines and audits, and as always, in most businesses, right, basically the stress on limited resources, in particular IT resources and the particular skill levels required to be able to manage these types of DR systems effectively. And that's just to name a few of the drivers. The little secret is that disaster recovery is not primarily caused by a natural disaster, hurricane, earthquake, flood, tornado, etc. If I'm a gambling man, those are not the odds I'm laying on having my problem. If you look at the pie chart, you quickly see the causes are very normal daily issues in operating, maintaining, and using our systems. Disasters are caused by our frequent daily activities, which is why the risk is so high and why people don't necessarily consistently align them with the impacts of disasters, right? I think the nomenclature is a bit misleading here. Plain and simple, business increases their reliance on IT. IT infrastructure, its management, and users become the primary causes of business continuity failures, right? It's sort of a vicious cycle that we have to manage to. And as reliance increases, so do the cause of failures. It's not if it will happen, it's when and then how you will respond. So everyone really knows the impacts if we don't get this right. We all know who's generally seen as responsible as well, and this is really where IT can be a very thankless job. In order to ensure that the DR gets the correct amount of attention in an organization, it's important to model the risks proactively, communicate the risks to peers and management, have mitigation in place, understand where the current mitigation is weak, and to determine with leadership what the organization's risk tolerance is. Ultimately, you will not be able to manage to every single risk, but it is a much more effective approach to proactively understand what the tolerances are and then basically to benchmark yourself against your goals. Now, we conduct another webinar similar to this budgeting webinar on just this situation on how to do that assessment. We've put together a simple approach that allows you to quantify the risks, to be able to understand the impact department by department or business partner by business partner, to assess the mitigation that you have in place and its sufficiency, and then to be able to give you a risk profile value. It's a very helpful tool to use for the business conversation. And I think one of the challenges that we have in IT is resources for DR, right, compete with every single other, investment that could be made by an organization. And sometimes I don't think that we are all as effective as we would like in terms of making the appropriate case regarding the impact to the business if this is not done correctly. In one dimension, these costs are the costs associated with downtime, right? And at the highest level, people just basically say, oh my gosh, I'm exposed. It's either $5,000 a minute, $74,000 a year, it's this or it's that. These are from industry consultants, so they're objective third-party numbers. We all know that there's impact, and I think this makes a good high-level general statement. But again, I encourage everyone to go through the simple risk assessment methodology that we have because you can more contextualize this to your specific business and the impacts that are most relevant to you. This is all the beginning of how you start to do the cost justification for a DR investment and how you have a DR project compete effectively against other projects in the organization competing against limited capital. The model starts to provide more detail for the cost analysis. Though as our previous slide has shown, there are more costs than just labor costs and revenue costs, right? These two, though, are the most prominent ones. The model also provides a benchmark for reference. Interesting that the benchmark isn't 0 on this slide, which basically means that every organization will have monetary impact from some type of outage. It's really what your business tolerance is, and then how you manage to it and the agreement in your organization about what that response should be. No one likes to be surprised, so it's best to proactively set a goal and track performance against it. And today's seminar on budgeting for alternatives for response will ensure that you basically do an objective, thorough analysis of what the costs of the alternatives are to respond to this need. And basically the risk assessment educational seminar we do will help you facilitate the contextual risks in a presentation format that's really designed for a business conversation. This slide is an IBM slide. They do a nice job here at categorizing risks that may affect a company. And again, when you look at this closely, what you basically see is business impact risks here 90% of them involve IT and IT systems. Again, just to point out how critical IT systems are to the successful operation of the business. Again, all risk categories involve IT, and the most frequent ones are data-driven, right? And those are the ones that we're typically using every day in IT. These risk elements are a good example of the items that need to be included in an organizational risk assessment, along with the current mitigation approach that you have in place. And making certain that that mitigation aligns with the company's risk profile becomes very, very critical in having an overall successful DR program. Determine risks, there are many methodologies. Enterprise risk management, John mentioned that I basically was in charge of enterprise risk management, both from a standpoint of selling engagements, but also for Bearing Point, the entity. Some of them I have found to be very broad, encompassing all aspects of business continuity. Some are more focused, for example, specific to IT infrastructure. I generally have seen that they can be expensive to implement and to basically go through. I'm very sensitive to the fact that most IT departments are really struggling with cost and resource constraints, and that's why we built out our own model here at nScaled for people who are interested to use. We'll go through that, as I had mentioned in the webinar workshop. Certainly you can ping us as to the timing of that, and the templates are available to you. But the methodology we put together is an approach to quickly assess IT infrastructure risk and organizational impact. Here's an approach we think can assess your company's risk tolerance, right? There's no real magic in doing this. First, you have to understand the risks and the company's risk tolerance to outcomes. Second, you have to determine what actions you will take to mitigate and how to best implement them. Third, obviously, once implemented, you want to monitor and assess if they're effective. And then the component that's missing here is the most effective approach from a cost standpoint to implementing your mitigation strategy. And we'll go through that shortly and give you a working document so that you can comprehensively and easily be able to do that. At a high level, we provide an example of the process that identifies risks, identifies impact if they were to occur, and then uses RTO and RPO to have you determine how recent and how fast access to data needs to be recovered. Okay, I think most of us on the phone are familiar with RTO and RPO, and basically part of your assessment regarding the impact of your systems is what information is going to be impacted and what's the time sensitivity around that information not being available to your organization. Okay, again, this is a very high-level summary just to illustrate the components of an assessment for you. To figure out how to prioritize risk, most methodologies require that you define all your risks, the impact of the risk if it occurs, and then the frequency with which you may experience the risk, right? So basically, it's impact times frequency equals, how big the risk is. The biggest risk impact occurring most frequently is clearly the first area you need to focus mitigation on. So if you have to triage it, very simple sort of algorithm to use in terms of getting your approach organized. Now, this is going to be a little bit of an eye chart, and I apologize, but budgeting is primarily today's focus with our seminar, but this is an example of the simple methodology we have available to you to determine your risks, the impact, the stakeholders that will be affected, the risk rank, and how well your current mitigation will be in the event a risk occurs. There's another tab on this worksheet. This is just a screenshot, and that second tab in the worksheet calculates your organization's overall risk profile and highlights where you should make improvements, right? And so I encourage you to use this type of template as you engage in this initiative to create the baseline of the business need. Once that's done, you can look at the approaches, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then use the budgeting template detail to figure out what the most cost-effective approach for your organization is. Again, the combination of the two documents gives you a very objective, very thorough and comprehensive, yet efficient approach to make a very effective decision for your organization that's clearly documented and justified and would withstand an audit. Once you've completed your risk assessment, the next step is to review the mitigation you currently have in place. You can use this sort of template that we have here, the 7 tiers of disaster recovery from SHARE, which is an independent user group that's out there, to determine where you are relative to the available mitigation approaches and to determine if your current response is sufficient against what your specific risks are. Okay, we sort of like this because I think this generally captures right, the spectrum of automation around, and comprehensiveness as well as automation, around disaster recovery. Business continuity planning and disaster recovery specialists like nScaled typically like this Tier 7 type context. And the idea here basically is that the solution is sort of self-sustaining, automated, uses world-class workflow, provides proactive alerting, and assists you in monitoring that the system is always ready to go and always within the RPO and RTO settings that's appropriate for your organization. Again, these types of approach remove some of that human error that we saw earlier in the presentation, indicates that most of the failures are basically sort of quote-unquote data-driven, which are typically us working with our IT systems and or maintaining our IT systems. Those are the things that most frequently will cause downtime. And again, this slide represents a little bit of a translation from the prior slide that we just reviewed. And you can see it's intuitive that as you get near continuous uptime, the technology pretty much becomes much more automated over time, right? And basically what that's saying is that if in effect you integrate components manually, right, not only do you have potential areas of risk at the points of integration, but they generally take more manual intervention to be able to operate. And I think a lot of us understand that the more automated and consistent the process is, right, and I sort of hate to say it, but I think it's just been proven true, the less human intervention, the more secure and predictable the systems are. Now, getting into sort of what the alternatives are, once you determine where you want to be with the types of technologies that are available, right, we basically can kind of see there's really three ways to do this. You can do it yourself, and there's some suggestions here. You can mirror storage, you can manually integrate point solutions, you can get into vaulting, you can use an appliance, you can utilize a co-location facility for backups. We see that the second alternative is outsourced. You basically give it to a solution provider, sort of a managed service. It's kind of like do it yourself. You're just relying on someone else's resources to be able to do it. And they typically will have infrastructure from a provider. Not at all self-service, right? Again, you're very dependent on the provider. As we all know, right, you have to pay a premium for the provider's resources. In some instances, it's probably cheaper than you hiring your own resources to do it by virtue of the fact that the provider may get an economy of scale. But again, there's a high level of human intervention there, and typically these systems that are available in managed services are still one of systems created for your organization, right? As much as you can negotiate an SLA against that, again, it goes back to the fact that these are manually integrated, interfaced systems that become reliant on humans to be able to execute, and typically you don't have a lot of visibility into the system. And again, some people prefer sort of out of sight, out of mind. Some people prefer basically let's build it ourselves. And then some people prefer the third solution, which is recovery as a service, right? So you basically can see the system typically through a console. There's end-to-end workflow in the system. Backup and recovery are seamlessly integrated. And there are things like automated testing, alerting, right? There's an interface that you can use, right? And the infrastructure is provided for you. It's sort of a nice combination of the two. The one thing that Dan will talk a little bit about, and you'll see as we go through a tangible model, is that generally the economy of scales by leveraging the cloud come through and typically give you much more cost efficiency. So again, build it in-house, find an outsourced integrator to build it, use newer technologies to lever the cloud. Now, I don't really want to speak out of school, but generally what we're seeing in the marketplace is that a lot of the outsourced solution providers have come to nScaled to ask us if they could white label our product. And we are actively negotiating with a number of them. Lord knows we like distribution like any other organization. But the reason for that is that they can't give that functionality, that level of functionality at the price point that we can by virtue of the way their model currently works. And that's a huge statement because remember, these managed services guys, their business is IT. It's not like they use IT to support their business. Their business is IT. So that's a huge validation you may want to think about. So again, you got to determine your risk tolerance objectives. You got to determine the service level and approach, RTO, RPO, what alternatives you want to use. Got to figure out how much functionality you want to be able to control. And then you also need to understand the level of expertise and automation required in your organization. What I mean by that is, do you have enough systems administration resource to dedicate a portion of their time to being able to maintain, test, and ensure that this is properly operating? And I should say monitor, maintain, and test. And then basically, do you understand and are you comfortable with integrating these particular technologies relative to the skills these systems administrators need to have? Do you have the ability and time to implement them? And then are you aware of all the detailed support costs? So typically what we look at are the project costs for a lifespan of the approach for like 1 to 2 to 3 years. Okay? And again, what approach is right for you? I think that's very critical, and I think we're going to talk about all of these with a methodology for you to use. And again, you can apply the budgeting methodology template to determine the most appropriate approach based on your preferences and the cost efficiency quota for those as well. So now what I'd like to do is to introduce Dan Linder. Dan does this on a daily basis for us, managing our professional services team, and talking to prospects and customers alike about how is the best approach to implement this, what's the most efficient approach, how can we automate this, and what gives organizations the most value. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Dan Linder.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, we're going to jump into the spreadsheet templates and examples in just a minute. But first I want to provide some context and mention that the objective of this IT disaster recovery spreadsheet is to give you an approach or a methodology to map where your company can improve on their DR, their RPO, and their RTO, and also to reduce the project overhead on your IT staff. The goal of this planning exercise is to determine what variables are important to your organization and use them to tailor an approach that makes sense for your company. Understand that every company is different, so we cannot assume every variable that's going to apply for each of your companies. But after working with hundreds of companies to improve their disaster recovery preparedness, we think this approach is valuable, it's useful, it's a very good step in allowing data to drive your decisions. So on this slide that's currently being shown, we have some calculations that are used in the spreadsheet based on this slide. This slide shows the underlying assumptions behind these type of calculations. You'll see that we have a domain controller, Exchange server, database server, and some continuity servers. So for a total of 23 servers, RPO targeted for less than 15 minutes. We've got some RTOs listed, some help desk, and approximating some uptime guarantees. So these are the underlying assumptions that we're using in our calculations for these examples. Okay, so in the do-it-yourself overview, this is a common consideration for many companies. It provides a lot of control, and the idea of a custom fit is quite alluring. However, it does take a lot of time and attention from the IT organization and from business management to run a do-it-yourself project, and it can be painful. Organizational ability to successfully complete large, complex projects varies between organizations, and if your organization is not one that can handle that gracefully, then it might become very, very painful. Outsourced solution provider is similar to do-it-yourself. You're just using vendors and consultants, as Paul mentioned before. There is a broad range of solutions available in the marketplace, but there's some challenges around vendor management that you might have to deal with. You have to find the right partner fit, and as Paul mentioned, this can be a bit expensive. Okay, and then recovery as a service. This commonly includes cloud backup, online storage, cloud disaster recovery. It's all in a single package. The value here is that you're leveraging a pre-existing capability and infrastructure. The installation process is potentially much faster. There is some vendor management involved in this, but the UI and tools are typically not customized for your company's unique nuances like they might be with a DIY or a custom-built outsourced product. So with that, let's get into the spreadsheet template and review the approach, discuss some of our assumptions, and highlight how you can begin planning. Note that we're going to move through this pretty quickly, but I believe this information will be made available to you after this webinar. We're going to start with the template model, and we're going to go through and just look at each section to understand what each section is about so you can use it appropriately and understand why it might be important for your company's planning. So the first one is, the first section here is file recovery. This addresses the infrastructure and labor needed to replicate the data from your production servers to a local backup device and then to the remote site. To properly scope and design your immediate needs and also future growth, you need to determine several things. the amount of data that's in use currently, and the amount and rate of future growth. The server recovery section addresses the infrastructure and labor needed to replicate the compute aspect of your production environment. This allows you to replicate your virtual servers from your production environment to a remote site. This assumes, of course, that your production servers are virtual servers. And to properly design this, you need to determine the number and type of servers to be replicated, and you need to properly scope and size the compute capabilities in your remote site to mirror or handle your expected performance. In the RPO and RTO section, we're looking at labor to install, configure, and maintain the replication functions for both the data and the servers. Again, the acronym RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective. This is the amount of time between the snapshots, and this duration determines the amount of data you may lose should a failure or a disaster occur. Any changes since the last snapshot will be lost. And it's important to note, any increased server snapshot frequency also increases the load on the production server, both on the CPU and the I/O. So if you have a very short RPO, your users may experience some significant latency. So you need to ensure that servers with low RPOs are built to handle the overhead necessary so that the users don't have unacceptable latency. RTO, or Recovery Time Objective, is the amount of time required to make the latest snapshot available to the end user so they continue working. So this is where the risk analysis that Paul shared with you comes into play. How much data are you willing to lose? How quickly do you need the systems online after a failure or a disaster event? Each system or each application may have a different risk impact and probability, so the RPO and the RTO may be different for each. Okay, moving now to the SLA section. This section speaks to the system reliability, which is related to your risk analysis. Uptime guarantee has two different components. Most obviously, it's the uptime when the servers are running in the remote site, presumably after a disruption or a failure. But it can also include the reliability of replications and that they work in a remote environment when they're spun up. We've all probably experienced the frustration of having tape backups fail when we need them. Again, reliability requirements may differ between servers or applications, business groups, and you'll need to determine what risk levels your business is willing to accept. The testing section is about the ability to test the system to ensure that the replication and application stacks work as expected in the remote site. Remember that changes in the production environment are replicated to the remote site. Because the remote site may be set up differently than your production environment, you'll need to test the production snapshots in the remote site without impacting the production users that are still working on the production network. And so you'll need to consider for each of the servers or application stacks how much testing is needed and how frequently should this testing occur. Again, you want to make sure that any of the production changes that are made and are replicated to the remote site are going to allow the server to be spun up and function properly should you need it to. The capacity management section speaks to the monitoring of the systems and expanding capacity when needed, specifically the storage and compute capability. You'll need to consider several factors here. What is the expected growth rate of the server counts and the storage that's used? Also, what is the change rate of the data? If your replication solution moves deltas, then your change rates determine the amount of space consumed by each snapshot. If you have high deltas, you're going to take up more storage. If you have low deltas, then you're going to take up less storage. And that may change over time. The alerting and monitoring section speaks to standard network and system alerts and monitoring. This ensures that servers are functioning properly. Existing monitoring tools can be extended possibly to monitor additional local and remote servers, possibly with minimal cost. The admin interface allows you to administer the local and remote virtual servers. This ensures that the replications are occurring as expected. You can spin them up, you can turn them off, and you can manage the history of snapshots. Some important questions to ask here. Can your network monitoring tools or your virtual server tools monitor the snapshots to ensure that the minimal RPO is being met? Can your support staff easily use these tools so that they can provide timely support? An admin interface frequently will provide these capabilities to you. The Runbook section addresses the best practice of creating a runbook for a remote site. It ensures the servers can be spun up in the correct sequence, where correct sequencing is necessary, and it requires if any configurations are required at the time of spin up, that they can be made timely and accurately after a disaster event occurs or downtime is being experienced and your team spins up the servers. The compliance section addresses the many specific technology requirements that might apply to your organization's compliance requirements. As Paul mentioned earlier, it could be worm-compliant hard drives, PCI, HIPAA. There's a whole myriad of requirements that might exist, and so this section allows you to address those. Security controls looks at technology and audit-based verifications. For example, many companies require some sort of data encryption, and some companies require ISO 27001 certifications. And then the implementation, this contains the effort needed to coordinate, design, and build a disaster and business continuity solution. It should also hold some contingency time for unknown unknowns that will surely arise in a complex undertaking like this, especially if you're doing something from the ground up in a do-it-yourself mode. Okay, so we're going to move on and look at a few examples of these three possible approaches that Paul mentioned before. So let me comment on a few important caveats around these models. Populating these models requires unique inputs, and every business has unique and different needs when it comes to business continuity, as I said before. And labor rates, for example, are different across the country. So we tried to use reasonable numbers in our examples. We erred on the side of conservatism. And that said, you may find better pricing on some items, which may offset other line items where we were too conservative, or it may offset the cost of additional line items that we didn't include in your model but are relevant to your business. So for a useful apples-to-apples comparison between these approaches, the models each use the same hourly rate for labor, and the same sections are represented in all three of the approaches. And even though your DIY estimate might be lower than our example, consider the relative cost between the three different solution types. As Paul mentioned, the costs are frequently different between year 1, year 2, and year 3, so we have columns for those 3 years. And there's also a column to the right, the far right, to make note of any relevant assumptions that might be important. Okay, let's go to the DIY spreadsheet. And we're going to move through these spreadsheets again relatively quickly, so you may not have time to carefully consider the values that we put into these spreadsheets. And I'm not going to spend each time on each section like I did on the template. I'm going to focus on several of the sections within each of these models that deserve some additional attention or commentary. So in the DIY, let's go down to the RPO and RTO section. Here, note that the RPO requirement for this section is less than 15 minutes, which can be problematic. Snapshots consume the CPU and the I/O. So you would need to make sure you have a production server with the ability to satisfy this RPO level without causing unacceptable latency to your users, as mentioned before. The specific requirements here are solution dependent. Different technologies have different RPO capabilities and consume system resources differently. In the SLA section, note here there's 5 nines, or 99.999% uptime, which is not typically achievable with DIY solutions. Technologically speaking, this requires a robust design, redundant capabilities, and which are usually cost prohibitive. Usually we see 94 to 96% uptime, which is more typical for a well-designed and rigorously built DIY solution. And how well it's designed and how rigorously it's built is obviously very dependent on your organization and their tolerance for detailed process and the time frames involved. This model also assumes that the support staff will handle the backup and recovery systems. And the hours that I've shown here are for training hours, where the engineering team transfers knowledge to the support staff. Moving down to the integrated admin section, a DIY will typically use a tool, such as the VMware SRM, to administer the virtual servers and replications. This tool may not provide the information or the interface that you need to monitor and maintain your system, and this needs to be considered when defining your company's needs. And moving down to the security controls section, different businesses have different security needs. So we've modeled 3-man months for each of 3 different audit groups: internal audit, external audit, and just an overall audit. And this was consistently done for all 3 approaches, so if these audits don't apply to your business, the relative cost difference between the approaches is still meaningful. It's the same throughout all 3. And then down at the bottom here, I've got some additional comments listed here that we'll reference in each of these models. With the accountability, as a DIY solution, there's no external entity with a legal obligation to ensure that the solution is going to work. If you build it in-house, it's all on you and your team, the IT staff, to make sure that it's up and running and stays that way. Enhancements and improvements are strictly going to come from your use and your team. There's no other users on the system to test the system, make sure it works, identify edge cases, identify improvements over time, which, when that's possible, a lot of those issues can be found by one user set, and then those benefits can be reaped by everybody who's on the system. In a DIY situation, it's simply going to be your organization. So it may take time to find some edge cases and some issues, some bugs that need to be fixed in order for the system to run smoothly. Implementation time might be an issue. This is a ground-up approach. It'll likely take 9 to 12 months to complete. Many people think of this as a one-time cost, but remember that you have maintenance. You've got mandatory technology upgrades, bug fixes, and enhancements. And these are going to continue into year 2, year 3, and even beyond. Disaster logistics. In a disaster event, who's going to be available to run your DR servers? Who's going to build a replacement infrastructure while the DR servers are being run? It may be difficult for the IT resources to do both at the same time. And will the in-house technical resources be able to be available when needed for the recovery? If you're suffering from a disaster, a natural disaster, say, what percentage of resources may be lost to the disaster, either through mortality or the need to go home and take care of their family? These are things that need to be thought about. Other possible issues, resources with specialized domain knowledge and experience are going to be required to build and maintain and use the system. What's their availability in the marketplace, and at what cost? And what other internal projects are competing for funding and resources? Paul did a good job of addressing that earlier. So these are things that need to be taken into account when you're looking at the DIY approach. All right, let's switch over to the outsourced model. And again, I'm going to take the same approach here. We're going to go down to the approach. Let's see. Okay, let's go to the. Well, let me just summarize here on this approach. This is an integrator approach. It uses the best-of-breed technology and different approaches, such as Tier 1 data centers, mandatory redundant copies of your data, and this is how the outsourced vendor can be sure that they're going to meet your uptime SLA commitments. Typically, it costs more money to build this level of robustness. And so the question is, does your expertise in building a DR solution match that of an outsourced firm? If so, then DIY might be more cost-effective than outsourcing for you. And if not, then it might be a good idea for you to rely on experts who've done this before. But there is going to be a cost differential. So if we go down to the costs here at the bottom are very, very similar to the DIY model because they're essentially going to be the same line items throughout the spreadsheet. The integrators may get some cost leverage on reusable components, volume pricing, discounts from vendors, and these cost savings may be significantly, if not totally, offset by the additional level of robustness required by the integrator, which may or may not be necessary for your particular organization. But because there's an SLA, they're going to insist that redundancy or robustness be put into the system. So the integrators, they're going to add anywhere from a 30 to 50% margin, depending on the size, complexity, and risk of the system to be protected. We're using here a 35% margin on the spreadsheet, and this margin accounts for the cost differential between the DIY and outsourced approaches. Again, going down to the additional comments, there is an external entity with a legal obligation here to ensure that your solution works. That's one value of having an outsourced provider. Similar to the DIY model, this solution is a custom integration, so there may not be any other users on the system to test the system and identify improvements over time. Implementation time will likely take 4 to 6 months to complete. It's very, very similar in many ways to the DIY model with those few caveats. Okay, let's move over to the service provider tab. Okay, so looking at the file recovery and server recovery sections, some of the expenses from these file and server recoveries will still apply. You're still going to need local and cloud servers for data backup and replication, bandwidth, power, rack space, for example. But most of these expenses are eliminated because you're working with someone who's already built a system and you're leveraging an existing working solution. You're not building a solution from scratch. And you're going to see this throughout the spreadsheet, that many of the costs that are in the other approaches are included. And they're highlighted here in yellow so you can see them very easily on the screen, because you're leveraging an existing solution. Going down to the RPO and RTO section, you're still going to need to install and configure the replication software. The hours in this model have been reduced, however, because you're going to be using a proven method or tool that integrates with the rest of the business continuity system. And vendors will typically offer support and training to assist you, so this isn't a situation where you need to figure it out on your own. I've conservatively used 3/4 of the DIY hours for this. Most likely it'll take you 1/2 to 1/4 of the DIY hours. In the SLA section, note that 99% uptime is possible in this model because of the economies of scale provided by multiple users, and having a robust system that's built out to handle multiple users. Similarly, 24/7 help desk support is available. The man hours for training with engineers and support staff are kept the same, and this will still probably need to be done. You need to transfer knowledge from engineering and training up the engineers and also training up the support staff. In the testing section, we're going to need to have testing subnets more than likely in the solution to allow testing of the production snapshots in the remote site without disrupting users on the production network. Again, this is something we talked about in the DIY spreadsheet, and most providers should have this so that you can test periodically and make sure that your servers, with all your production patches and changes, will still spin up and work properly without having to disrupt your production users that are currently on the system. Capacity management section. With the service, you'll easily be able to see the capacity on the local and remote systems. Adding storage is easy. It requires minimal effort and minimal time from your IT staff. And also adding additional compute capability requires little to no effort from your IT staff. The alerting and monitoring, and also the integrated admin interface section. The admin interface that is going to be included with these services are going to include alerting and monitoring capabilities. It's built specifically for your team to use. It's included in the service. Again, because this is a multi-user sort of environment or service, it may not be exactly the way you would want to design it with the UI and the various tools and such, but it's been designed to be effective with the methodology and the approach of the system and the service as designed. The security control section, because the data centers and solutions have been audited, you avoid the time and hassle of managing security audits and correcting audit findings, so that's marked as included. And then in the implementation section, it should be a straightforward process because it's been done before with other clients. It's not a brand new, one-off, never been done before, do-it-yourself sort of process. So training, support, and testing may be provided as part of the service, or parts of that may be available as add-on services depending on your vendor. Here at nScaled, we train the client on how to use the system and the associated tools. And then going down to the additional comments below, again, with accountability, there is an external entity with a legal obligation to make sure the solution works. There's constantly enhancements and improvements being made to the system and being tested through the use of multiple clients that are on the platform. So that's a huge benefit to leverage. Disaster logistics is also an important thing to consider. Your service provider, your vendor staff may help with disaster logistics and can monitor and run your remote servers up in your remote site while your IT resources are building out your new infrastructure. So it's not just your IT team doing everything by themselves on a DIY system. There's actually some vendor help in monitoring and running your remote site while you take care of business on your local production networks. And then implementation time is significantly less. This typically takes 2 to 3 months to implement, depends on the complexity and different variables here. But it's much less than the DIY solution or the outsourced solution. So in summary, making the choice between these approaches is really about evaluating the level of effort, your resource availability, your budgets, and what's available on a budgeting perspective, the time needed to build and implement the solution, where your company falls on the shared scale and the desired position on the shared scale, and also a risk tolerance, both on a disaster or interruption level as well on a project level. taking on this level of complexity to consider all of these items, find a solution that works for you, and then, for example, building it yourself from the ground up is quite complex. Some organizations can do it well. Others have a more difficult time with that level of complexity, so it's something to consider. So with that, I think I'm going to pass this over to Paul and head towards the Q&A section.
Thank you, Dan. That was outstanding. So it was sort of interesting looking at the budgeting templates for DIY, outsourced systems, and then basically the cloud approach. Right. The one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was what Dan was mentioning about implementation consideration. Right. The time to value for these things are very important. And when we take a look at this, right, our average implementation is 30 days for recovery as a service. Outsourced, typically 4 to 6 months. DIY, assuming that you can put enough resource on it, 9 to 12 months. Implementation also gives you a sense of the complexity, and obviously complexity is related to the risk of success. We all know basically that a number of these projects take a long time to do. The longer they take, the more kind of gremlins that can come up, right? So, the other conclusions I think that we can make here is that assuming functionality in RPO and RTOs are similar, I know Dan basically said typically services are 5 nines. Maybe when you do it yourself, it's not that high. Maybe your outsourcer won't agree to that SLA. Over 3 years, recovery as a service is 28% of the cost of DIY. It's 21% of the cost of an outsourced solution provider. Right? And when you look at implementation again, it's 10% of the implementation time as compared to do it yourself. It's 16% of the time to do managed services. Now, when you think about these things, right, as we do as business people here at nScaled, right, that is really the disruption that cloud technology brings to disaster recovery. If you look at what Gartner is saying and Forrester is saying and the momentum of the market, the compounded annual growth rate of companies moving to cloud-based disaster recovery, it's at about 30 to 32%, where the standard market is about 12%. This is really why we created nScaled, right? We've been in business since 2009. We have 117 customers, a statistic that personally I'm very proud of because we worked very hard at this. 97% of our customers are retained, and that's from the inception of the company. That's not on a yearly basis that we retain 90 or 80%. That's 97% of all the companies that we've implemented are still customers. We work with all types of verticals. The company is basically located in San Francisco. So with that little commercial notice, let's go to Q&A.
Okay, great. So it appears we have a question, and the question is, what are typically the fully loaded cost factors associated with compliance? And I don't know which one of you would like to pick that up.
Compliance is a very broad topic, right? And it's going to be a little contingent in terms of what are the specific compliance requirements you need to respond to. And, again, when we refer back to the risk profile template, the working template similar to what Dan showed you for budgeting, but obviously for risk, you would capture all of the compliance requirements that are relevant for your business. Based on what those requirements are, you can make the assessment as to what's the appropriate RPO and RTO to address them. But it is really based on your business. Now, the one caveat I will say there that's important is, remember, it may not just be limited to the compliance requirements specific for your vertical if you're doing business with businesses outside of your vertical, like the example we used earlier.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. And a second question we have that I think is, again, a toss-up between the two of you, is at what size do economies of scale play a factor?
Well, I'll start with that. We talked a little bit about sort of the cloud-based recovery as a service model, and I think that obviously vendors like nScaled take advantage of that. Potentially, I think the buying power for large systems integrated managed service providers can pass some of that through. I think the difference with that model basically is that you're still paying for labor, and generally that labor is at a premium. But the key really is that economies of scale can be applicable to even the smallest organization depending on what model you're using. And again, I go back to the cost comparisons between recovery as a service, do it yourself, and a managed services systems integration approach, just to punctuate that point.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. I think that's it for questions, folks. And I'd like to thank you for attending today. I want to let you all know that I will be sending out a communication to all of you detailing where to download and get these templates, and also be able to review some of the webinars that Paul spoke about earlier. We do have 2 interrelated webinars that are very useful for this process. And we'd also like to know if this webinar is useful and interesting to you. We do a lot of webinars over the year, and we found that this type of project management and structuring, disaster recovery, online storage, and backup is very useful to the attendees. So we'd like to hear from any of you about what you thought was useful, and if there was any more information that we could add to the webinar to make it even more useful for future attendees. So again, look for an email from me detailing where to get these templates. And again, thank you for attending. We appreciate it very much. Have a great rest of week and long weekend. Thank you, folks.